So hi everyone, I'm very happy today to be joined by composer Samuel Andreyev, who is my first interview guest ever. Samuel is a Canadian composer living and working in Strasbourg, France. He writes wonderful music which is played all around the world. He teaches in Strasbourg and in Freiburg in Germany, and he runs a great YouTube channel and a podcast about music and composition, which I highly recommend. And in addition to that, Samuel is also a writer, a poet, and published two volumes of poems. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me, Samuel.
My pleasure. Good to see you.
I would like to start things off with a maybe rather difficult question. In one of your latest podcast episodes, you said that as a composer, it's good to have a clear aim, a goal, to know what you're good at, what you would like to say, and maybe what you can contribute that no one else can. So my question is, what's your goal as a composer?
Yes, that's not an easy question.
Yeah, not every question will be like this.
It's made even harder by the fact that it's my own advice. So that really puts me on the spot. What do I do that is my particular unique goal? Well, I think that a simple way of answering it is that I have a somewhat unusual background, and I think my music reflects that. So what I've tried to do is to create a synthesis of my own experiences and also the music that I'm interested in, which is maybe a banal thing to say because I suppose that's what everybody does to some extent. But I've really tried to integrate everything that I think is really important in music. And so it seems to me that really important or profound works of music have a particular quality, which is that they're able to express a sophisticated worldview. So in other words, the project of the piece can encapsulate many different things all at the same time. So the piece will have many different layers and levels to it. Mm-hmm. I don't think you can necessarily do that intentionally. I think it comes about as a result of attempting to integrate things into your work properly. So for instance, I think a lot about perception, about what is the connection between a device you might use in making a piece and what the listener actually hears in it, so that there isn't necessarily a complete vacuum between those two things. I think a lot about expression, about comprehensibility, about poetics also. Literature and philosophy are very important to me, and as is, of course, music history. I'm a scholar of music history. I'm always trying to learn more about what composers did in the past and trying to extrapolate out the things from that were valuable, and trying to see if there's something I can distill from that might help me in my own work. Mm-hmm. So I think maybe what I've done is I've tried to bring a vast amount of things into play in my own work and distill it down into the few things that I think are the most crucial and critical. So I've tried to achieve a certain degree of richness that way. I'm absolutely not claiming that I've been successful at that, but that's been what I've attempted to do.
Mm-hmm. And is it similar for writing? So why do you compose and write poetry? Are these two things similar for you, or what are things that you can only do with one of these art forms that you can't do with the other one?
It's easier to be wildly experimental in literature, partly because there are fewer professional contingencies involved. Mm-hmm. So, the cost of writing an experimental poem and having it fail is extremely low. Mm-hmm. It's basically a non-issue. There's no barrier to experimentation in literature, none whatsoever. It costs nothing to write, it costs nothing to publish, it costs nothing to share it with other people. So there's a kind of extraordinary immediacy and freedom you can get in poetry that I don't think is possible in the same way in the composition of music. So poetry has often been a kind of testing ground to see what I can do. How far can I push it? What new things can I bring into the poetic act, so to speak? And it's also something where I can be very extemporaneous. So a lot of the poetic projects that I've had over the years have been things that have emerged very organically, as simply as a result of playing. So the way those two activities are integrated, it's, well, I'm not a professional poet, so to speak. I mean, it's not a big part of my professional life. And I didn't study literature or anything like that, but I'm fascinated by it and very passionate about it. So it's just something that that I've always done. I've started writing poetry when I was maybe 12 or 13, very extremely bad poetry, obviously. But but it's an artistic discipline that I've always been fascinated by. I think partly it's a matter of being intrinsically attracted to smaller forms, to putting a lot into a very small space, and to seeing how much you can compress into just a short text. That's something that's very appealing to me. So
Yeah, so do you have a similar historic or traditional approach? Do you study the history of literature as much as you study the history of music?
as much? No, probably not, for time reasons, but I do try to read very widely, and I try to get into the subject with as much depth as I possibly can. But I mean, I know people who are quote unquote real poets who devote their entire lives to that topic, and I can't bring the same level of depth to it. It's just not possible. And I know poets who are just phenomenally well read. They've just read everything, and they've uh, and they're able to spend incredible amounts of time on that. So I'm limited in that sense, but
Yeah.
within what I'm able to do, I try to go as far as I can.
Okay, I'm interested in that because I don't know it at all. I'm not involved in this scene, but would you? How is the scene of experimental poetry? Is it comparable in size to the audience of contemporary music, or is it smaller, or different, or
I think
bigger?
it's I think it's smaller, and the audience is a lot more splintered.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of contemporary poets, the vast majority of them have an extremely small readership.
Mm-hmm.
So, and even actually quite established poets will sometimes put out a new book and 100 people will buy it, which is small,
Mm-hmm.
very small. Uh, a tiny infinitesimal number of poets will get a larger readership than that, but for the most part, it's quite small.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know exactly why that is. Perhaps, perhaps it's simply the fact that more people are interested in music than in poetry. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that I do like about the poetry world, or at least one thing that I enjoyed about it when I was deeply involved in it in Toronto when I was younger, was there was a real sense of community that was really quite wonderful. People reading each other's work, attending readings. There was a social dimension to it. There was a sense of a very deep engagement on every level. And there was also a relative absence of what you might call sort of professional ladder climbing, partly because in poetry, let's face it, the stakes are extremely low. It's true that you can win prizes and you can get university appointments and that kind of thing, but for the most part, it's an activity that has no real reward system.
Mm-hmm.
So that takes a certain amount of pressure off of it. I think things might be a little bit different now, but at the time that I was, really involved 20 years ago or so, that was how it revealed to me. It was a kind of esoteric and purposeless activity for which there was no particular basis for competitiveness, except for maybe competitiveness in the sense of, can you write a better poem than this other person? Can you write something more exciting? Can you go farther out? That kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of nice. In the music world, That sometimes happens, but there are a lot of professional pressures. That, you know, projects are complex to do, they're expensive to do. There's a lot of competition. You know, the cost is just much greater, and there's more complexity involved. So
Yes. So have you ever thought about setting your own poetry to music?
I've done it. In fact, I did a
Oh.
piece, yeah, which is unpublished,
Mhm.
called 19 Songs, and that was a group of texts that I wrote myself and set to music. It wasn't a successful work, and I withdrew it. The reasons it was unsuccessful, there were a few reasons. First of all, my technique at that time was not on the same level as my ideas, let's say. So I've often sort of gone back gone back to the score and looked through it and tried to see if there was a way that I could fix it up and publish it, but I don't think I can. I think it's got too many problems to be saved. Also, for me as an artist, it's very difficult to write a text and then write the music for that. I don't know why exactly. Maybe those two dimensions of my creativity are too compartmentalized, and I find it really hard to bring them together. But I haven't. That piece was written in 2001 or 2002, I don't remember, and I've never tried to do it again since. So it's also the case that the particular types of texts that I write don't particularly lend themselves to being set to music. And one of the things that I've often found, especially recently, because I've been looking for things to set to music, is that, you know, just the simple fact that a poem is a brilliant poem or that it's interesting doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to lend itself to being brought into a musical setting. There's a lot of poetry that you simply can't set to music. It doesn't work. It's meant to be recited. It's meant to be read aloud. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe the type of language isn't really appropriate. It might be a fantastic work, but it doesn't work. So you have to find things that you can actually bring into the musical sphere, and it will work aesthetically and musically.
Okay. So to come back to your personal trajectory as a composer, you started writing and recording a lot of more experimental pop and rock songs in your home in Canada, which is rather untypical, I would say, for a contemporary composer, or one does not think of a contemporary composer recording pop albums in a home studio. But are there things that you got from this singer-songwriter home studio approach that are still relevant for your current work?
Absolutely. One of the most exciting aspects of it was the dimension of play. You know, one of the nice things about recording in that way is that very often I would start with a skeleton for a song or a recording, not necessarily a song. A very, very simple elementary idea, and then you would go into the studio and try different things out and see what worked. So you could take a kind of heuristic approach to putting the piece together. You could try it 15 different ways and then see. So that approach has its disadvantages. It's not particularly efficient because you can waste a lot of time trying things out that go nowhere, but it also can result in discoveries that you would not make otherwise, right? Because you're not going at it with too specific an idea of what you want to end up with. So I took a lot from that. And also there was a period of about, I'm going to say almost 10 years of my life where that was just a daily practice for me, was going into the studio. And I worked with every imaginable type of instrument also. I used to I used to go around Toronto on garbage day and look for things that my neighbors would be throwing out. And they threw out the most incredible things: synthesizers, drums, you know, broken keyboards, woodwind instruments even. Uh, and I used to go to the pawn shops, the sort of junk stores in Toronto, in downtown Toronto, and buy things like, well, I have one here in my office. Maybe you can see it, this hi-hat,
Yeah.
this symbol that I have next to it. I bought that for $20 on Queen Street in Toronto. And I still have it. So things like that. So I amassed this collection of cheap old broken instruments, which I would try to fix up and make recordings with. And it was just literally whatever I could get my hands on. It didn't matter what the instrument was, if it was an accordion or a clavichord or a hi-hat. And I would try to do things with that and come up with interesting combinations of sounds. So I did that for years, every day. And I think that certainly sharpened up my ears. It made me very, very attentive to sonic characteristics of instruments and how can you combine them. And also because it wasn't just a matter of playing the instruments, it was also how do you record them, how do you get the best sound out of them, how do you mix them afterwards. And just this process of trying out thousands of different possibilities, I think was a very rich and positive experience for me. The reason I stopped doing it, there's a few reasons. First of all, I got more interested in notated music and in composition around when I was 17 or 18. So I had to stop and focus the necessary attention on that. But also, I had a sense that in terms of possible forms, it was very limited. So after making 7 or 8 albums like this, and maybe a couple of hundred songs, I don't remember now, there was a sense that I could keep doing this indefinitely, but would I really be inventing anything new? I felt like I had exhausted what I could do within the limitations of that particular form. So, and I wanted to go farther. And I was also getting interested in the Second Viennese School. I was very, very interested in that. And when I first heard Webern's Sätze für Streichquartets and things like this, that for me was a music that was totally fascinating because it had nothing external imposed upon it. There was no form, no traditional form at least. The music seemed to start from something organic, from a particular type of material that the composer invented, and then the form was extrapolated from that. And the thing that I found very limiting about writing, even experimental pop music, is that it almost always has the same forms.
Yeah, that's good to know about Webern. I have to analyze these pieces in my next theory exam. So, but you are clearly interested in popular music, so especially more exploratory, surprising pop music. And I was wondering if you still follow some pop musicians of today.
Not very much. No, not very much. I'm not very connected into that world at the moment. And it's not to say that there's nothing interesting happening in that space. I've just sort of progressively drifted away from it. I have other concerns, I suppose. Every now and then you hear something that's really striking, and that's always nice, of course, but I don't have the same degree of interest in that as I used to. So, but it might also be, this is maybe a difficult claim to make, but I had a sense that something extraordinary happened in the late 1960s and early 1970s that I don't think has really happened again in the same way since, which is that there was a temporary coming together of the avant-garde and the popular. And it only lasted for a few years. And this was maybe between 1965 and maybe 1971 or 72. And after that, it was all over. But there was a feeling at that time that the post-war avant-garde in Europe and what some of these phenomenally successful pop acts in Britain and the United States were doing somehow had a meeting point. It was this brilliant flash that happened. And I think part of the reason that flash happened was because of a mutual fascination with recording technology that both the composers and the pop musicians shared. I can give you one example that I still think is absolutely remarkable. In 1969, Pink Floyd released an album called Amagama. If you listen to Amagama, there's a lot of content on there that if you did not know it was on a pop record, you would have no way of knowing that it wasn't a piece of musique concrète. And it's just very strange to me that that album would have sold millions of copies and been, you know, a very important album commercially and also in terms of the trajectory of Pink Floyd. But there are things on there that are as far removed as you could possibly get from pop music. It just doesn't sound like pop music. It isn't pop music, in fact, most of the time. And I'm fascinated by that album completely destroys those kinds of boundaries. And it was phenomenally successful. And there's no pre-established forms on it at all. I often wonder, how could that happen? And why did it not continue to happen? Because after Amagama, Pink Floyd then reverted back to a much more standard kind of blues rock. Very good, of course, and they had lots of things about their subsequent recordings that were brilliant and innovative and all of that. But that same degree of how far can we push things, how far can we investigate the limits of this medium, they never quite recaptured that in the same sense afterwards. I suppose it has partly to do with commercial pressures and the gigantic success of the Dark Side of the Moon album. But anyway, so that was a period that I was and am extremely interested in. I don't really see an equivalent to that today. And maybe it's something that can't be repeated. You know, it's with respect to the classical tradition in music, something that Charles Rosen, the American writer and musicologist and pianist, has commented upon is that with Mozart, you see the coming together in a brilliant flash, again, to use that term, of the most esoteric artistic development on the one hand. So it's the very highest level of artistic standards. And also of a popular language. And those two things fuse together in Mozart. And his argument is that that never happened again in the same way. Not even Beethoven could do it. So I think occasionally there are moments, very brief moments, where you have an intersection between the need to take a given discipline to an extraordinarily high level, on the one hand, and then something popular that everybody can understand. It almost never happens.
We already talked about this once, but I was surprised that when you asked your three students in your podcast who was a composer that they thought has a big impact on the current music world, they couldn't really name like a contemporary composer, but they mentioned Jacob Collier, which I found quite funny. But yeah, he is one that I would say is pushing limits and does very, very interesting things. I don't know do you know his stuff?
I do. I don't know it particularly well, but I have a sense of what he's doing. Yes, I think that's right. I think that's right. I think that there aren't really very many composers who are pushing any kind of limits for a few reasons. First of all, the new music world, quote unquote, is highly institutionalized now. And the vast majority of young composers are struggling to survive within it, to make a living, and to attract the favor of the people that can offer them commissions, which is a natural course of things, I suppose. But it also means that you do have tens of thousands of young composers, maybe not tens of thousands, I might be exaggerating, but a large number, certainly many hundreds, who are doing exactly the same thing with very minimal variations. In terms of the way they're approaching this profession, the way they're going about writing their commissions and the sort of audience that they're writing for, it's the same. It's not expanding it, it's just filling that same circle. And I think there's a feeling that if you try to go too far outside of that, then you might not be able to make a living. So it's like there's this tiny little narrow door that everybody's trying to cram into. in order to get into this space where they can hopefully get commissions and make a living. And what Jacob Collier is doing is he's not trying to get into that little tiny narrow door with thousands of other people that are all doing the same thing. He's just ignoring it, and he's going into this much bigger door that's just right over here. And that is the door that is offered, of course, by the internet and by new technologies and by a bringing together of things that aren't normally associated with each other. So he's interested in music theory, microtonality, composition, and popular music. He brings all of those things together. And that's a very powerful thing. It's much more powerful in terms of its societal impact than writing another string quartet with that's going to be played a few times, maybe once by the erudities and then forgotten. So,
yeah, I really like also that he's taking some other musicians with him, so he does a lot of collaborations, and I think that he will have a big impact, and hopefully I will see his concert in February in Berlin. But so when I wanted to ask you about your studies in Paris. So when you were in your 20s, I think you moved to Paris to study composition. And
yeah, when I was 22.
Okay, so how was it at the prestigious conservatoire? How was your experience?
It was very exciting. It was very, very exciting because I had the feeling that this was the first time that I was able to not only write the sorts of pieces I wanted, but also to get them performed very soon after they were composed. That was a really big deal for me. Because up to that point, of course, I was writing pieces, but it was extremely hard to get them played. And in many cases, it took years between when a piece was finished and when I could actually hear it. Whereas at the Conservatoire, I could write a piece for a specific atelier or a specific project, and then a few months later, it would be performed. That was really, really nice. It was also a very international place, and I found that very stimulating. So in the year that I was admitted to the conservatory, there was I think there were 2 French students out of 6, and the rest of us were from different parts of the world. And the whole program was like that. At any given time, if you added up the 4 years or the 5 years of the program, there'd be maybe 30 composers at any given time working there. Maybe it's less than that. Maybe it's more like 20. In any case, out of the 20 composers, let's say, there would be many different countries represented. And it was also a place where you could really focus on what you were doing. And there were so many opportunities to hear concerts and to attend interesting courses and interesting guest lectures. We had so many wonderful people come in. Heinz Holliger came in and gave a lecture. I was able to have lunch with him. That was really exciting for me because I'm also an oboist, and Holliger is somebody that I admire very much.
Oh yeah, I forgot that in the introduction.
Yeah, that's it. So George Benjamin came in, Klaus Huber, all of these wonderful composers. And we got to talk with them and meet them and have a sense of belonging to this world. And in my case, I spent many years sort of hanging on to the very edges of the world, just trying to get a foothold so that I could write my pieces and have them performed and maybe meet some other people that were doing it too. And that was extremely difficult. And then suddenly you're in this world where you're allowed to do all of that. And that was a tremendous gift.
And when you arrived in Paris, you didn't immediately go to the Conservatoire National. You prepared for it before?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I arrived in 2003 in Paris, and then I started studying at the Conservatoire in September 2006. So there was a 3-year period where I was studying in municipal conservatories in and around the Paris region and preparing. At that time, it might be a little bit different now, but at that time, it was a crazy thing to attempt to do. for a few reasons. First of all, to my knowledge, no Canadians had previously been admitted to that program. So I didn't know anybody who had done it successfully, who had gotten in. It was extremely hard to get in. There were weeks of exams. I mean, the entrance exams were weeks long. There was one exam I remember that was 18 hours long. Where you had to arrive at 6 in the morning and you left it at 10 o'clock at night.
What was that exam? What did you have
That one,
to
I
do?
believe, was, I believe that was the orchestration exam, where they would give you an early 20th century piano piece and you had to score it for full orchestra. And it was really crazy. They had guards. They had an entire floor of the conservatory building roped off so that nobody could go there except the people who were sitting that exam. And there were guards outside of your little room watching to make sure you didn't do anything. And if you wanted to use the bathroom, you had to go and ask the guard to escort you. It was really crazy. And and the entrance exams took place in 3 stages. There was an eliminatory round where if you couldn't do the basic dictation exercises and solfege and all of these sorts of things, then you couldn't advance to the next stage. Then there was an admissibility round where you had to do all these different exams. And then if you got all the way to the end of that process, then you could do an interview with the jury, and then they would talk to you and look at your work and so on. It was enormously stressful. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done in my life up to that point. And that took a lot of preparation. But I had a clear goal because I had a sense that if I could get a spot in this school, then first of all, just for me personally, that would be a way of breaking through a personal barrier in a certain sense, that I could actually show myself that I was able to do that. That was important to me. And secondly, it meant that I would have a chance of being able to be around like-minded people and a kind of community of that sort. And hopefully that would lead to further opportunities. So that's what I decided to do. And I was really obsessed with that idea and single-minded about it for years. You know, I maintained that focus for the entire 3 years that I was preparing to get in. And so obviously when I eventually was offered a spot, it was a kind of euphoria. It was extremely exciting.
You tried once and made it? Or did you try?
I did it. No, I did that whole exam process 3 times.
3 times, okay. So each year?
Each year, and each time I got all the way to the end. The first 2 times I got to the exam, the interview with the jury, and it was at that stage that it didn't work out. And the feedback that I received at the time was that I was insufficiently familiar with more current developments in music, which on one level, I suppose, is perhaps a justifiable criticism, but I think today I would consider that to be, you know, not an optimal approach to selecting students.
Yeah. I mean, also that's not, I mean, you could still learn it during the studies. So, but anyways, yeah.
Well, look, what I could have said, I could have said, go screw yourselves. I'm going to go to Switzerland or Germany or the UK. And quite frankly, I think that's what a lot of students quite rightly would have said. But I didn't do that. And I think part of it wasn't even so much that I was convinced that this was the only school worth attending. I think I had a sense, and the problem is I'm very single-minded. I had a sense that I needed to succeed at this, and it was an intuition. I didn't know why, but I needed to go all the way to the end with this particular ambition that I had. So if I were doing it over, I probably wouldn't have done it 3 times. You know? But anyway, that's what happened, and it worked out, so that's fine.
Well, one of my professors who also went to the conservatoire recently told the story that when he first arrived there as a how do you say Erasmus student, he was very shocked and intimidated by the hearing by the dictations that they would make. They apparently, when the first time he went there, they would hear a Mendelssohn trio 2 times and would have to write it down and make an analysis of it. And I think you told me about that once too.
Yeah, it was difficult. It was very, very difficult. And there was a lot of rigorous preparation involved.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that they did at that time, and I think they still do, is called a commentaire d'écoute, which is where you are given a blind recording to listen to. They don't tell you what it is. And you get to hear it 3 times with maybe a 5-minute break between each hearing. And then you have to prepare an extensive analysis of what you've heard without looking at the score, without knowing what it is. So it's really a test of your culture in a sense. You have to show that you can determine what the period is down to the closest decade. If you have a sense of who the composer is, that's even better. Mm-hmm. You have to be able to talk about the style, about the aesthetics of it, about the structure, about the materials, the forms, how is the piece put together, and in detail. So it's actually a wonderful exercise because, first of all, you don't have any of the context you normally have when you're analyzing a piece of music. You don't know who wrote it. You have no idea when it's from. They can give you anything, to listen to. It can be a 15th century mass, or it can be a piece by Stockhausen. It can be anything in between. And so you have to be very quick at sorting out, in detail, what is the time period and what's going on in the piece and what can you say about it. Mm-hmm. So, but that's very, very difficult because you have to absorb an enormous amount of repertoire. You have to understand what you're hearing. You have to link up your ears and your brain and be able to describe it. And you have to have a broad range of analytical tools at your fingertips so you can instantly come up with some kind of an explanation of what's going on in the piece.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really miss that, all of this hear training and solfège and all this stuff that is in France. In Germany, it's very underestimated, I think. So at the Musikschule, at the conservatory where you learn your instruments, you don't have to do this at all. And I think in France, you have to. And I really miss
yes,
that.
I think, yes. The French schools have always insisted on technique, mm-hmm. technical virtuosity. That's been the case for centuries, and it's still the case now. Not just in composition, but also in all the theoretical disciplines and in the instrumental domain as well. So there's a kind of obsession with technique, which is both a good and a bad thing. It has its obvious advantages and disadvantages. I think what I notice in a lot of international composition programs is that they're not exactly sure what to focus on because the range of skills that composers are asked to have now is extremely broad. And a lot of people just can't quite sort out what is the place of traditional techniques in that. Mm-hmm. Do you need to learn them at all? Is it better to just take composers into a studio and teach them how to do spectral analyses of recordings and teach them how to use audio sculpt and open music and Max MSP and real-time signal processing and things like this? Mm-hmm. Are those skills more important than knowing how to write a fugue? Do you need to have, a lot of extensive knowledge of contemporary instrumental techniques? You need to focus more on the repertoire of the last 20 or 30 years. So I think that a lot of traditional skills have been de-emphasized, and there's maybe a little bit more focus placed on things that are extremely recent, mm-hmm. which I see as a catastrophe for the art of composition. Not because students should avoid contemporary things, obviously, but because if you don't start with a foundation and with a sense of where this art form comes from, what are the basic things that it does, because I believe there are things in music that don't change across the centuries. not specific technical things, but more like archetypal things in terms of how does music function? How does it create sense? How does it create a feeling of movement? I don't believe those things change. And if you don't have sufficient historic depth and knowledge and understanding of these things across the centuries, then you're stuck with an extremely limited view, I think, of what music can do.
Mm-hmm. And do you think this this lack of connection to history and tradition is, I mean, you talked about this also last time we saw each other, but do you mean the composers or the audience or both?
Both. It's
Okay.
the same problem fundamentally, because composers are also in the audience, and there's
Yeah.
also, yeah. So, no, both. But I want to be really clear about a point. It's not a question of imitating the past or of creating pastiches of historical styles or anything like that. But I believe that an artist locates themselves paradoxically or finds themselves through a kind of mishearing of the past. Because whenever we listen to works from the past, we misunderstand them, we misinterpret them, because we weren't there, quite simply. You know, we weren't alive 300 years ago. We have no idea what it was like to live in Vienna in 1740. So we have a filtered understanding of what happened at that time, and there are certain things that are going to that we're going to connect with, and other things that simply won't reach our perceptive faculties at all.
Mm-hmm.
But it's that very filtering, that idea of you engage with the work of the past, with tradition, and there are certain things that manifest to your perception as being critical, and you don't know why. But then you amplify those things, and that's where you locate yourself, I believe.
Mm-hmm. I mean,
And
the
that's how
question,
you can find a path forward also.
mm-hmm. The question then I sometimes ask myself is, what tradition do I have to look at, or what do I want to take with me? So why should I know, I don't know, Ligeti, one of Ligeti's works, rather than, I don't know, one album of Herbie Hancock, for example. I don't know, but yeah, it's difficult for me to know exactly what tradition we're talking about and which one we should connect with. And
It's a dialectical process. I mean, one of the things that I do when I teach analysis is I alternate very recent works with classical works or pre-classical works. So we might do a piece by Buxtehude one week, and then the next week we'd look at something by Berriot.
mm-hmm.
And then you try to see, is there some kind of a common thread on some level? And that's very stimulating.
Mm-hmm.
So bringing different things together and trying to see what you can extrapolate from that, I think is a very useful approach. But to some extent, obviously, it's a personal thing. You're going to be more drawn to certain artists than others, to certain traditions more than others.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important to investigate these things so that it doesn't simply remain a question of intuition, but that you're also bringing your critical sense, your critical faculties to bear upon these things that resonate with you.
Yeah, I mean,
So you're looking at, well,
what
what are the specific qualities, you know?
Mm-hmm. I think what I meant is that I'm not sure if I want a composer to necessarily know the music of Buxtehude very well, and of Bach and all these composers, but maybe there are composers who know, I don't know, John Coltrane and Pink Floyd and Lachenmann very well, and maybe this is a fruitful tradition too, without necessarily knowing what Mozart exactly did and all these things. But I'm not sure about that. But yeah, I don't know if you know what I mean, but
Well, I would say it's always a good idea to be interested in music as a broader human phenomenon. So in other words, it would be just as limiting to be only interested, if you were a pianist, for example, only to play late 19th century music, which a lot of pianists do. You know, if that's your repertoire and that's all you're interested in, I suppose you can be a hyper specialist in the music that was written between Schumann and Liszt, let's say. But that's also very limiting. So taking an interest in music as a very broad phenomenon from lots of different cultures, different historical periods, and just having that sense of openness, I think, is a tremendously enriching thing. So
Yeah.
it doesn't matter to me if it's a recording by Herbie Hancock or an improvisation by Keith Jarrett or whatever. It doesn't matter. But as long as you can fit that into something more broad, having a sense of context, historical depth, historical continuity, so that you can see beyond the surface attributes, the stylistic attributes of what somebody is doing, and peer very deeply into the why of it. You know, why is it being done this way? How does it function? What does it tell us? What is it doing?
But how about then the tradition of the audience? If for example, a composer has a very good knowledge of, you know, like you said, I don't know, Buxtehude and Berio and let's say Herbie Hancock and Pink Floyd, but an audience member has a completely different culture. Do you think there's then some kind of misunderstanding that's happening, or?
No, I don't think so, because look, I know absolutely nothing about technology and engineering. We're talking to each other. I'm using my MacBook Pro. I have no idea how this machine functions. For me, it's just a box with keys on it, and I type it and I click the mouse, and then we're connected. And I think there's some degree of that also in music. You don't necessarily need to know the whole background. You don't need to know how something's put together technically, or what the references might be, or everything that went into creating it. It might help to have a deeper understanding of it if you know some of these things, but you're not going to interface with all of that when you're listening to the piece of music.
But so maybe when you think that there's a lack of connection to tradition in a piece by a composer, maybe it's just that you don't see the connection to a tradition that you don't know, or to a musical culture.
No, I don't think that's it. I think when there isn't enough depth in a piece of music, it shows. It shows. You can hear it. The piece isn't doing very much, and it's not going very far. I think that's the problem. It's not that it needs to. It's not that you need to write a 6-part fugue or something, and have, you know, the technical command of all of these different things. That's not the point at all. It's just that if the composer is not going far enough, or is reaching for solutions that are too proximal, things that everybody else is already doing, and doing a slight variation on that, then I don't think that's very interesting. What I'm interested in are the few people that jump completely outside of that and are able to go a lot farther than everybody else, and bring something really unique and personal to the table. And I think for that to happen, obviously you need a strong personality. You need to work extremely hard. You need to be, you need to be talented, at least to some degree, in order to do that. But there's a quality of depth and richness that I think is also necessary. And that doesn't mean complexity, and that doesn't mean technical virtuosity necessarily, although it might mean that.
Okay, to come back to Paris, your teachers were Franck Bedrosian, Alain Gossin, and Frédéric Durieux, I think. So could you name some important things that each of them taught you?
Well, Franck Bedrosian was the first, and when I went to see him, I had just arrived from Canada, and my knowledge of contemporary composition was extremely limited. I knew very few things. I was familiar with the big names you know, the big composers, Ligeti, Boulez, Stockhausen, Berio, things like that. But I wasn't familiar with Lachenmann, I wasn't familiar with Crize, I wasn't familiar with Ferniholt, I wasn't familiar with Charino, any of these things. So my encounters with Franck were very stimulating in the sense that he would give me lists of things to listen to, and he would say a few words about, you know, why he thought this or that piece was interesting and worth listening to. So he broadened my range of experience, so that was very useful. With Alain Gossin, the main thing I got from that, I think, was a sense of paying attention to issues of perception and memory, and how do you structure a piece, which is something that I hadn't really grasped with, perhaps, up to that point. And then with Durieux, what was really valuable with him was separating out things that were authentic features of my work from things that were acquired habits, but that didn't really reflect in a deeper sense any kind of originality or any kind of genuine creation, right? I think this is the case with practically every young composer, which is that you pick things up more or less unconsciously. You're like a sponge, and some of those things will be deeply integrated and then synthesized into something personal. And some of those things will just be like you take a surface element from here and you sort of stick it into your piece, but it's not been integrated properly. And you haven't really maybe thought enough about why it belongs there. Does it belong there? What is it doing? What is its function? It's just you've just stuck it into the piece. So he was very good at separating those things out and saying, you did this, why did you do it that way? Is it actually serving a function in the piece, or is it just an unconscious habit? Mm-hmm. And that was a difficult process because you really had to think about every dimension, every aspect of the piece, down to the tiniest details, and think very carefully about if it's necessary or not. So that was a process of burning off all of the dead wood, so to speak, and trying to get as close to possible to a more distilled language in which everything was there for a reason.
Did you specifically wanted to go to these teachers, or was it more random? Or?
No, I didn't know any of them. I didn't know any of them. I knew I wanted to be in Paris, and I knew I wanted to study at the Conservatoire. But at the time, I didn't know who any of these people were. You have to remember, when I left Canada, it was a complete leap into the unknown. And it was a decision. It wasn't a decision that I made having first done a lot of research and thought and looked into different schools and researched the music of all the teachers. I didn't do that. It was an intuitive decision. I want to be here. This is the place that I feel like I should be in order to go as far as I can in a particular direction. So the encounters that I made in the first couple of years were fortuitous encounters. They were unplanned. I didn't know who I was going to meet. And some of them went nowhere. Some of them were not fruitful encounters. And some of them were very positive. So with those three particular teachers, I got some very valuable things out of my interactions with all of them. Yeah, so I was lucky that it worked out as well as it did, because I really didn't have a plan.
Yeah, and so at that time, and maybe still, but you were quite, let's say, eccentric, as you also say about yourself, because many of the other students, other composers were, like you said, writing or coming from that Lachenmann and Gérard Griset world, and writing this post-spectral, post-musique concrète instrumental music, but you were quite eccentric and unique in that regard, that you didn't really go these two paths. And was that difficult for you? Did you encounter a lot of resistance?
It wasn't particularly difficult because I didn't really ask myself those sorts of questions. It was more like I knew what I wanted to do and I knew what I was interested in. I was open-minded enough to listen to lots of different things and to be curious about a lot of different things. But I also knew that I had something particular to say, and there were things that I knew I could do that other people weren't doing.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, it probably made things easier. I think it's always easier if you know what you're doing, or you know what general direction you're heading in.
Mm-hmm.
And I was fortunate enough to have that from a very early point, where even if I failed completely, at least I had a sense of what I was aiming at.
Mm-hmm.
And so there were criteria for success and failure. Because if you kind of have a sense of what sort of music you want to write, and you keep failing at it, then at least you can do a course correction and try to get closer to your goal.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you have no idea what you're aiming at, and you're just shooting arrows blindly in all kinds of different directions,
Mm-hmm.
then it's very hard to build upon that.
Yeah.
So
No, continue.
yeah, so I had a sense of what I was aiming towards, and I didn't really have a sense of pressure coming from other students,
Mm-hmm.
but it was hard not to notice that my concerns were, for the most part, quite different from theirs,
Mm-hmm.
with a couple of exceptions. There were a few people that I could have a real conversation with, and with whom I shared certain common interests. And even with people who are doing very different things, I could still pick up things from them. I was curious about what everybody was doing, so I would go and talk to them and listen to their pieces and try to understand what they were trying to do, and sometimes I could get something out of that. The pressure that exists, maybe, I think, was a little bit more subtle. It wasn't necessarily a question of anybody coming up to you and saying, you should write in a different style, or you should be interested in this, or you should be interested in that. And I suppose in my case, I just was impervious to that pressure. It didn't really affect me very much,
Mm-hmm.
because I had already, by the time I started at the conservatory, I wasn't young. I was 25 when I started there. When you're 25, or at least in my case, my personality was formed. I knew what my interests were. I had my technique was basically formed by that point. And I wasn't going to radically change my course,
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah. So while we're at studying, I think you talked about this in your last podcast episodes, that about composition and universities, and composition as being framed as research. And I think you don't agree with that. Why? Why is that?
well, of course, in a certain sense, composition is research, but I don't believe it's research in the bureaucratic institutional sense
Mm-hmm.
that is often imposed upon it now.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think composers belong in universities. I think that they've ended up in universities by default because there's maybe in many instances nowhere else for them to go.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think it's an ideal scenario at all.
Yeah, for me it
So,
was a bit confusing, because I think I don't really know the difference between the universities in Canada or the United States and in Europe. So my university, for example, is called Universität der Künste in Berlin, but I think
yeah.
it's like it's more or less like the Conservatoire in Paris. I think, I'm not sure, but so I
Well,
was just looking.
yes, a lot of European schools have the ability to give out university diplomas,
Mm-hmm.
master programs and doctoral programs and so on, but they're not really based on the university system in the same sense that North American universities are.
Yeah.
They're in a lot of cases, they're essentially conservatories, but that have subscribed to the European norms of what diplomas you can give out. So they've had to adapt their courses so that you can end up with a diploma at the end of it that is in accordance with European norms. But it's not really exactly the same thing as a North American university. So at the Paris Conservatory now, since maybe 8 or 10 years, I can't remember, it's possible for composers to obtain a doctoral degree. But you do that in partnership with the Sorbonne, right? So it's not as though the conservatory itself can propose those sorts of programs. So
Okay.
so it's a little bit different. I think the thing that I find really problematic is the idea that you would have a kind of a ghetto in which composers study music at a university and then they seek employment in the university, and it never really gets outside of that little circle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We just talked about Ligeti, and I think I recently saw a documentary where he said that he thinks of himself as a researcher, and that he just does his thing at home and researches something and wants to solve a problem, and then doesn't care if there's an audience for that or not, and if the thing that he worked on is culturally relevant, will be decided after years. And yeah, I was wondering in that sense, maybe what I understand as research for Ligeti, for example, is when he writes musica ricercata, for example, he researches how to write a piece with one single pitch or something like that. Is that, would you call that a research, or is that something else for you?
Well, that's a kind of authentic research, yes.
Mm-hmm.
It's like what in Germany used to be referred to as the style recherché, the idea that you would write a type of music that was erudite or that was pushing some kind of technical limits.
Yeah.
Which is what Bach was always trying to do. And not just Bach, plenty of other composers were working in that direction. And that for me is genuine research. But what I object to is this kind of bureaucratic language that's being imposed upon the cultural world at every level. And what you see happening in universities is composers having to frame everything in terms that a bureaucrat can understand in order to obtain funding and in order to justify their practice. And that, I think, is extremely toxic for this art form, because it has absolutely nothing to do with any kind of actual human musical experience, and everything to do with how do you obtain grants in order to remain within the university. So it's a kind of self-perpetuating system, but it's also one that is extremely dangerous for students, I think, because a lot of university programs are able to survive only if they have maximum enrollment. They have a lot of students paying tuition, particularly at the undergraduate and graduate levels. Obviously different in doctoral programs because there are stipends for that kind of study, but so what you end up with is thousands upon thousands of composers graduating from these programs every year in the United States with no job prospects whatsoever. And I think a lot of them go into it with the idea that at the end of it, they can find some kind of employment as a teacher. But that's extremely rare. The vast majority of them are not going to have any prospects whatsoever. And I think that's, and it just self-perpetuates, because then the more graduates you have, the more people you have trying to be teachers. And then the more teachers you have churning out endless numbers of students, and it just keeps spreading and spreading and spreading. And you end up with this absurd situation where you have thousands of people who are trained to be composers with nothing to do, really, and no opportunities. And so I don't think that's really the sign of health. Like these people, they might be very gifted, they might have something to say, and they might have great skills, but what are we supposed to do with them? And I'm not arguing that we should discourage them from studying, or that we should tell them not to be creative or not to be artists. I'm not saying that at all. I'm simply wondering if the university system is the best solution. And I don't think it is.
Now that I mentioned Ligeti, I have to think about your YouTube video about Ligeti, where I think you said that Ligeti's music is always process oriented. And you know, I recently read many of his own texts and writings, and he often says that he is not so much interested in process oriented music, but more in object like music. But that was something I was thinking about while doing my video about Ligeti. For example, in Atmosphère, he tries to create a music that is somewhat static and is like a thing that's not moving, and he tries to do this often. But for me, I always had a little bit of difficulty saying that this kind of music is static, because also in his most seemingly static pieces, like the first movement of the cello concerto, for example, there's always a build-up in tension and always almost a climax and then a relaxation. So yeah, I don't know if I would call this static, and I wonder what you think about it.
No, it's not. It's not static. There are always dynamic
Mhm.
processes at
Mhm.
work in Ligeti. Well, not always. There are some exceptions to that, but most of the time. I think where Ligeti has one big weakness, it's that he has a very limited range of formal strategies in his work.
Mhm.
So the sorts of processes, they're almost always linear, and they're almost always pointing in a particular direction and building up to a climax, and then abruptly you'll have some kind of a contrasting event happen.
Mhm.
And it's very easy to caricaturize that, which is not to take away from the extraordinary achievement of his music in any way. And all composers, of course, have things that they're more or less strong at, and other things that are less, a prominent feature of their work. But in that case, you do start to see the same kind of formal envelopes again and again in his work, particularly after the late 1960s.
Mhm.
So you see the exact same processes in the chamber concerto as you do in the second string quartet, for example,
Yes.
or in the double concerto for flute and oboe,
Mhm.
and they happen over and over again from work to work. Where there's a big renewal, I think, is after the horn trio and then the late concertos, the piano and violin concertos. Some of the very late pieces, I think, are really quite extraordinary. The Hamburgisches Konzert, for example, is the last piece he wrote. It's a very strange piece. I'm not exactly sure that it really holds together. It's made up of these little fragments. But there's something very deeply touching about that music somehow. Um,
Yeah, I think what he once said is that when you listen to Atmosphère, for example, as a whole, you realize that it's static somehow. And I mean, I would say that it's static like a river, for example, that it's always moving, but the river itself is somehow static at the same time. But I don't know if when you hear it, there's this effect of staticism. I don't know.
no, I don't.
Yeah.
No, not for me. It's moving, but it's moving slowly, like sort of like a very thick liquid. Some of those Ligeti pieces from the 60s, it's kind of like looking at a lava lamp, if you know what those are.
Yeah.
Where where it's projecting all of these sort of splotches of oil onto the wall in different colors and moving very slowly. And you can sort of contemplate these patterns that briefly emerge and then disappear again. It favors a very slow, immersive, and contemplative form of listening, I think.
And
but that's very different. He went through different periods in his work. I mean, that's very different from certainly the piano concerto or the piano etudes or even the second string quartet. So there you can see that there's a fascination with texture in the pieces that he wrote in the 1960s. And then later on, his music gets more explicitly polyphonic and less involved in micropolyphony and in mass movement of sounds.
Yeah, I mean, what I thought when I listened to Atmosphère, for example, and reading his text about it, I compared it, for example, to Morton Feldman's pieces, like Coptic Light, for example, or for Stefan Volpe, which for me feel much more static. How do you feel about that? Do you think that is static music, or wouldn't you describe it that way?
Well, static music is for me an oxymoron.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Because the essence of music is to move. That's what I think music is. So something that doesn't move for me is not music. The movement might be not linear movement. It might not be directional. It might not be goal-oriented movement, but there's always some form of movement. So the simple fact that something isn't moving in a straight line towards a particular goal doesn't mean that it's not moving. Some music has agitation, but not directional movement, for example. Or what's happening in Feldman a lot of the time is a process of microvariation, where you take a musical idea, a figure of some kind, and you present it 100 different ways in slight variations. And I think what that's doing is it's showing you the limits of what that material is. How far can you push it until it breaks and turns into something else? And you're looking at it from all kinds of different angles.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that music is essentially moving and happening in time. But I think the closest to have an experience of something static is when I listen to, for example, some of these pieces of Morton Feldman. I mean, for example, for Stefan Volpe, I feel like it feels like I am in a room or something, and I look at these two different things, and for me it's not like they're necessarily changing, but they are always juxtaposed, and then I relook at one of these things and I see another aspect or another detail of it, but it feels like I'm not going anywhere. I'm just standing still and looking at things. Whereas in Ligeti's music, I feel like I'm moving along with the music. I don't know
the
if you
movement
understand.
is yes, and I understand. The trajectory of movement is longer in Ligeti. You can relate things to a longer feeling of line, that you're moving from here to there over a span of several minutes or longer. In Feldman, the movements are local. They're very, very small, and then they're linked up with each other. So it's a different sort of movement. It's a kind of micro movement, if you like. But it's not completely static. For me, something static would be listening to a sine tone for half an hour.
Yeah.
That would be static.
Yeah.
Some of John Cage's pieces or Lamont Young do things that are along those lines. But those are things that I don't find particularly compelling to listen to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I think really static music would be boring. So no music we like, I think, is really static. But yeah. So we talked about Morton Feldman, and I actually mentioned the piece for Stefan Volpe, and this actually makes me think of your second piano piece, because I don't know, I had the associations because there are two different worlds that are just juxtaposed and are slowly changing each time. Would you say that it's a correct association, firstly?
Not exactly. I think there's a significant difference. That piece actually came out of, and it doesn't sound like it, but it came out of a kind of constructivist idea, actually. And the origin of it is pretty straightforward. I had a composer friend who was one of my teachers, actually, Alain Gossin, French composer, who was turning 70. And I wanted to do something to mark his birthday. So I tried to figure out a way that I could incorporate his birthday and also his initials into the piece somehow. So I decided to make a piece that would consist of 3 times 70 notes. So there's exactly 3 times 70 notes in that piece. And the letters A and G are the main pitches that you hear in all the harmonies throughout the whole thing. So as the piece continues, the A and the G initially are very closely spaced together. And then with each successive repetition, they get farther and farther apart until they're, I don't know, I can't remember, 3 or 4 octaves apart on the keyboard. So that was a matter of basically designing a piece in almost all of its smallest details before actually sitting down and writing the score. And I don't do that very often. I find that it only really works for me anyway on a very small scale, like in a short piano piece like that, where I can work out exactly what it's going to be like and then sit down and write the score. So the second piano piece for me is kind of an unusual item in my catalog in that sense, because it really was worked out in detail in advance. But in terms of the experience of listening to it, I think you can tell when you're hearing it that there's some kind of a process at work. And there are several processes in that piece. It's funny because the piece sounds actually pretty simple, I think, when you listen to it. But there's a metric cycle that's going on in it, where there's a loop of 4 different time signatures that keep repeating.
Mm-hmm.
And the loop is not the same duration as the phrases that you hear. So there's a kind of an interference pattern that happens on that level. Then you have these very simple contrapuntal passages with 5 notes in the left hand and 5 notes in the right hand that keep recurring also. And they're based on a whole other structure.
The A and G.
And then you have all these different changing resonances and attack times and resonance times and the different chords you're hearing on the piano. So for a pretty simple short piece, there's a fair bit going on in it on a structural level. And in that sense, I don't think it has much to do with Feldman, because Feldman did actually structure things. We know that, and you can see it from analyzing the scores. But for the most part, as far as I can determine, he thought of composition as being a kind of performance in and of itself, where you would sit down and you would write the score in an almost improvisatory way, and you would react to what you had just done, and listening carefully. It would be a reactive sort of process, and you would discover the piece as you were writing it. And in this piano piece, I think it's too orderly and it's too structured to have too much to do with the way Feldman wrote.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's definitely more structured, I think. But maybe I had.
Well, it's also totally symmetrical. Like the structures are very, very regular.
And so, I mean, in this piece, you explained the process is these two notes A and G, or one of the processes. These 2 notes A and G are at the beginning very, unnoticeable almost, because they are the ones that are staccato, and then they get more and more prominent and in wide registers. And so there's a process that is somewhat interrupted by other things. And this is also something I noticed in Apropos, du concert de la semaine dernière. For example, this uprising figure at the beginning in the left hand, which is also going through a very clear process of expanding and getting higher and higher, but it's not, it's not linear, or it's interrupted by other things. And I think I noticed
that also comes from, what that comes from? I mean, the thing about studying counterpoint, I think that is interesting, is that it tells you a lot about some basic principles of composition in a way that studying harmony does not. When you study harmony, you learn a repertoire of chordal formations and types of chord progressions that other people have written in the past. But when you study harmony, it doesn't tell you anything about where harmony might be able to go next. It just tells you this is a catalog of things that worked in the past. That's all it is. And independently of language for the most part, incidentally. Whereas counterpoint is like a set of principles that aren't necessarily stylistically dependent. And you can extrapolate from that and do all kinds of things with it. And so if you mention the rising figures in Apropos, that is a very, very simple elementary first-year principle when you study counterpoint, which is that you have different contrasting types of motion in the voices, right? So you can have similar motion, parallel motion, oblique motion. That's all that is. So in the sort of main parts of the opening section of that piece, the register is like this, right? The hands are in the same space, and then gradually it opens up and the registration gets wider. So it's opening up like a fan. So that's one type of movement. And then you have a contrasting type of movement, which are these rising patterns. So it's just very, very simple contrasting movement types of motion. And I do that all the time. I do that in all my pieces, because it's one of the most fundamental and effective ways, I think, that you can create a sense of movement, which is critical in music. If there's no, if there isn't a compelling sensation of movement somehow, then it's going to be very hard for the piece to be compelling. And second of all, it's a way of creating contrast between materials and separating out materials in a perceptual way that's immediately graspable.
Mm-hmm. And talking about apropos, you told me also that I don't know if influence is the right word, but you thought of mosaic or stones sometimes, and I was wondering if things like that, visual things or objects, are often in your mind when you compose.
The influences on apropos were not musical at all, actually. It was when I was living in Spain that I wrote that piece. I lived in Spain for a year as a guest of the Académie de France à Madrid. And I spent a lot of my time that year going to museums. And I had actually a very good painter friend who was French, who was also staying there. And he was fascinated by Spanish painting. So he took me to all the museums in Madrid, all those wonderful galleries, the Reina Sofia, the Prado, and so on. And it was like I got a 1-year course on painting. It was really amazing because he could explain how all of these things were put together. And of course, we also went to see the contemporary and modern galleries. And during that year, I became really fascinated by a number of 20th century painters and by a kind of essential gestural freedom that they had in their work, where you could sense that there was a mastery that was there, a mastery of composition and of gesture, of color, of texture, all of these things. But there was also a kind of immediate sort of playfulness and spontaneity. And they could bring those two things together. And that was something I had really struggled with in composition up to that point. This would have been in 2012, 2013. I could, on the one hand, I could write pieces that were totally spontaneous, things like Le Malheur adoucit les pierres, which is a wind trio, where there was no premeditation. I just sat down and wrote those 5 pieces over the course of a day without any sketching at all. So I could do things like that. And then on the other hand, I could write pieces like 5 pièces pour flûte et percussion, which is an extremely complicated, minutely planned out piece that was really quite difficult to write. And it's just full of all of these quite torturous technical ideas that took months and months to figure out how to do. So there was like a schism, there was a gap between these two approaches, between a totally spontaneous approach and a totally pre-planned, exhaustive, technically demanding approach. And the thing I was trying to do during that year was to bring those two things together so that they didn't have to remain separate, so that you could absorb some of the technical things in such a manner that you didn't necessarily have to work them out consciously to the same degree. And also bring much more spontaneity and gesturality and looseness and immediate playfulness into the act of composition. So that's what I was trying to do with Apropos, which incidentally came right after Verification. Those 2 pieces were written back to back, basically, along with the cantata Iredescent Notation, the first version of Iredescent Notation. All those pieces were written in the same 1-year period. And so that was a really critical year for me because it allowed me to incorporate much more spontaneity into my way of working. And the mosaic idea was, I think, one component of that, because it meant that I could sit down and write a bar of music or 2 bars of music, or an entire page of a particular type of material, and then set it aside and then write something else, some contrasting idea. And then I could sort of cut them up and then paste them back together in some kind of a configuration. So, and then keep working on it and polishing it until I had it the way I wanted it. But I didn't have to plan everything out minutely ahead of time. So that's a big part of how that piece came together. And that really came from looking at painting. Painters such as Cy Twombly, for example, or Barnett Newman was another one. Barnett Newman never used to plan anything, but he was very meticulous in his work habits, but he didn't plan things out exactly in the way that we might understand it. So anyway, so those were I think that's where that was coming from. And I'm happy that I went through that period. It was an extremely important year for me in terms of my my output as a composer in 2012. For me, there's really a before that, and then there's an after, and it was not the same after that experience.
Yeah, it's really interesting for me to see what composers are thinking of or what influences they have. I mean, for example, I recently heard a new piece by Clara Ianotta where the whole piece is based on the molding of a spider. So, and a really concrete thing is for me, and other composers only have sounds in their head, or I don't know, poetry or something, and that really interests me. But talking more about your piano pieces and the works you used the piano in, I wonder about your new piano pieces. I mean, I really like them. I think they're really unique and original. And I think you said that they were one of the best things that you wrote. And I was wondering how you come to such conclusions. I mean, how do you judge your own pieces, and why are these pieces so good for you?
Well, I think a composer generally has an idea of what it is that they're after, even if you don't know, even if you can't identify it precisely. You have at least a sense or a feeling of some quality that you're searching for. And if you're paying attention to the creative process and to your feelings as you're working, you have a sense of how close you are or how distant you are from that goal. It's an intuitive thing, and it's hard to put into words. But there are pieces that other people think are perfectly fine of mine, but that I ended up rejecting because I knew that they somehow fell short, or they didn't quite do what they were meant to do. Which in itself, I suppose, is not a problem, because you can intend to do one thing in a piece of music and end up doing something else, and it can still be fine. But when there's an idea that I can tell is not fully realized, it's sort of halfway there, but not quite, then that really disturbs me. And then I either have to withdraw the piece or rewrite it, because I don't want it to be out in the world as a kind of statement or as a representation of my work, because it's not that. It's only partially that, let's say.
Yeah.
And in the case of the piano pieces, I had the sense that there's a certain essential freedom there, which is something I'm searching for, of course, but it has to be a freedom that is grounded upon something solid. It can't be this kind of fake freedom that comes when you are working without any kind of adequate background. You know, that's not actually real freedom. That's simply a lack of, well, a lack of background. And it doesn't, pieces like that often don't have sufficient depth. So I wanted to have that, but then also be able to do something that would be striking, hopefully striking, in the sense that there's a world that you are immediately plunged into when you listen to the piece that defines its own context very powerfully. That's what I'm always trying to do. So
Yeah,
I suppose I got the
often
sense that in
succeed.
the piano pieces, sorry?
I think you often succeed, and you succeeded in the piano pieces.
Thank you. I hope that that's the case. There were some technical problems also that I was trying to resolve in pieces number 5 to 8. And that took a long time. The first 2 pieces took about a year. And then pieces 7 and 8 were comparatively fast to write. Number 7 I wrote in a few days.
Actually, I mean, this is maybe quite a question for me as a pianist, but maybe it's interesting to know how you think about this, because in the 5th piece, I sometimes play things that are written for the left hand with the right hand. And I was wondering if that's something that bothers you, if you are if you want the visuals to be like you have written them, so everything that is written in the left hand is played with the left hand, everything in the right hand is played in the right hand, or is it not so important for you? is the sound more important?
Well, no, it's not purely visual. It has to do with gesture, and as you would know from working on things like some of the harpsichord music of Bach, which was written for a double manual instruments. The gesture is the cross hands gesture is totally different on a double manual harpsichord than it is on a piano, because you have two separate keyboards. But then there are things like the Webern variations, the middle movement of the Webern variations, where the hands are crossing all the time. And of course, you can rearrange it so that it's much more physically comfortable to play. But the effect is extremely different. There's a tension in that piece when you have to do the hands crossing, because there's so many huge leaps and it's really fast and it's extremely awkward. And that brings attention to the performance. And in terms of the weight of individual notes and the time it takes to cross the hands, and the physical gesture involved is not at all the same. And you can hear that immediately if you compare different recordings. So for example, when Glenn Gould plays the Webern variations, I don't think he bothers with the hands crossing. He just redistributes the notes. You can see that there's a video of him performing them. There's a video of Pollini doing them, and he does cross the hands, and it sounds very different, and it's awkward, and he misses some of the notes. Even Pollini. But I think you have to take that as being part of the piece when you do it that way. There's like a daredevil kind of component to it. It's like, is he going to be able to hit those notes at that speed? That is missing if you rearrange the notes. So in the case of my pieces, part of the reason that I do the hands crossing thing is to emphasize the differences between the lines and individualize them as much as possible. I had a conversation a few days ago on my podcast with a harpsichordist called John Moraitis, who has a really nice YouTube channel.
I discovered
and he's interested in
his channel.
Yeah, well, he's great because he's interested in contemporary music, but he's also interested in really early music, and he can bring those two worlds together. And one of the things that I've always struggled with in my piano music is I'm after a certain kind of sound that is closer to an early music type of sound, where it's really articulated, that the lines are always contrapuntal and polyphonic in their texture, and you don't have any of these massive sonorities and thick chords that you get with romantic repertoire. So every line is equal. That's the idea. That's the way I hear it. But at the same time, very often they're very close to each other in terms of register, and then they can like form a knot temporarily and then spread out again and then come back and then cross, and the voices are always moving independently of each other. And what I finally understood when I spoke with John was that you can do that much more easily on a harpsichord than you can on a modern piano. And the simple reason for that is on a modern piano, the strings are crossed. So the treble strings are crossed over the bass strings. That's just the way the layout of a modern piano soundboard is done. Whereas on the harpsichord, the strings are parallel to each other. They're not cross-strung. And so what that means is the bass strings will resonate on one part of the soundboard, and the treble strings will resonate in another part of the soundboard. And it's much easier to have a clarity of voice leading on that type of an instrument. So one of the things I've been thinking, because I've noticed that it's extremely hard for pianists to achieve that kind of clarity with these really exposed lines on the keyboard. And maybe it's a matter of trying out different instruments. Maybe not necessarily, I mean, John said you should try it on a forte piano. I think that's maybe going a bit far. But maybe a different sort of piano than the contemporary Bösendorf.
I can do that. My professor is a Hammerflügel player, so I can try.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, or at least an earlier turn of the century instrument, or maybe even a 19th century instrument. But that might be something worth trying, because the contemporary concert grand piano is not really built for that sort of repertoire, I don't think. It does something else, and it does it obviously spectacularly well. But if you want a very highly articulated and texturally clear kind of linear counterpoint, I'm not sure it's the ideal instrument for that. And when Gould would make his recordings in the 60s and 70s, he used a really modified instrument. I mean, he completely changed everything. He had piano technicians that changed the action so that his instruments had a really shallow action. And he did all kinds of things to change the mechanisms of those instruments. And you can hear it on recordings like the 2- and 3-part inventions that he made, where it doesn't sound anything like a modern piano. It sounds more like a forte piano with a more rapid decay and a really bright attack. And that's the sort of sound that I always had in mind, incidentally, when writing for keyboard. Not at all this kind of very warm, resonant, rich, thick kind of velvety sound that a lot of pianists tend to create.
And I mean, we saw you playing piano in your latest Bach video. Do you get some ideas for your piano pieces while playing the piano, or is it always at your desk?
Well, I write at a desk, but I'm not a very good pianist at all. I never trained, I never studied piano, but I've gotten a lot out of, I mean, I have stacks and stacks of piano music and I play every day. I play Schubert and Beethoven and Brahms and Bach and Mozart and Erik Satie and Schoenberg and whatever, Weber and whatever I have that I'm interested in. And I don't play those things well, but I play them well enough to have a sense of how they work ergonomically and what the hand positions are like. And so I've always got that in mind when I'm writing for the keyboard. It's not an abstract thing. I'm always thinking in terms of instrumental gesture and fingerings and where do the hands go and that kind of thing. And that for me is really important. It's the same with when I write for any instrument for that matter. Because I think you have to bear in mind that aspect of things. You know, when we think about some of the rules or the principles of classical voice leading, you know, you're not supposed to have parallel fifths. The voices, except for the bass and the tenor, the voices should not be more than an octave apart. All of these kinds of ideas. A lot of those are purely pragmatic things having to do with smooth voice leading so that your hands don't have to move too much as you're playing the chords. So there are tactile, ergonomic reasons for that. It's not a purely abstract theoretical concept. So
yeah, and
so I think it's yeah.
No, sorry.
No, that's it. Yeah.
Okay, and also, I mean, when you talked about this variation of the Goldberg variations you analyzed, you said, I don't remember correctly maybe, but you talked about this bass line that gets crazy at some moment. And in that sense, it actually reminded me a bit of your 7th piano piece, which also for me has this, I mean, crazy, for me almost jazzy bass line and this 2-part polyphony in the right hand. Yeah, is that something you thought about, this variation, or am I completely wrong?
No, I wasn't thinking about that. No, but I always liked the idea that you could have a polyphonic texture in which the voices start out being basically equal, and then one of them suddenly goes completely wild and takes over and starts just going completely out of the framework of the piece. But that has to do again with the idea of the fundamental independence of the voices, not only independence in a rhythmic sense, but also in the sense of character, that they can go on and have these wildly disparate trajectories and evolutions. So having some kind of a coherent harmonic framework and at the same time a very great deal of independence of all the voices is something that I strive for. And it was very hard to do that technically because obviously I'm not writing tonal music. I'm not writing classical music. That goes without saying. And my language is, well, it is what it is, but it's not like that at all. So I had to find a way to make that work technically because my music is completely chromatic.
Yeah.
And but it's not a kind of chromaticism that really stems from any kind of expressionism, or it's very, very distant from Schoenbergian chromaticism. And I think it has more in common with 17th century music, with a very free kind of linear counterpoint that can be quite dissonant at times.
And talking about your language, I was wondering, because one of my favorite pieces of yours is still stopping, that is quite old now, and I was wondering how you see your evolution as a composer of your music, from stopping to now. What has changed?
Well,
And
I'm glad you mentioned stopping. That actually fills me with pride because I really like that piece.
yeah,
And
it's
that
really
was,
beautiful.
thank you. That was the first piece of mine, I think, that where I liked it and also everybody I showed it to liked it as well. Because it used to be that those two things weren't the same. So I would like a piece, but then everybody else would, have some reserves about it, or my teachers would like it, but I wasn't quite satisfied. But with stopping, I was able to do something that both satisfied my own criteria and that people seemed to respond to, and so that was interesting. And that was the first piece of mine that got a lot of performances. So I think part of the reason for that is that I had to overcome a terribly crippling challenge when I was writing that piece, which is that making a duet for two vibraphones is almost impossible. If you want it to be something you would actually want to listen to, because the vibraphone is a very limited instrument, and making a 10-minute piece for two vibraphones, like with that, and have it be something that you might actually want to listen to, that's really hard. It's really there. I mean, there are certain instrumental combinations that should probably just be left alone. We probably shouldn't write them. But in that case, I managed to find solutions. And I think the way that I managed to do that was I spent at least a month, maybe longer, minutely investigating the repertoire for solo vibraphone. I looked at dozens of pieces and I listened to all kinds of things, not just composed music, but also jazz. And tried to get as detailed a picture of the instrument's technique as possible and how far you could go in that direction in terms of vibraphone technique. And also I wanted to know what are the specificities of vibraphone technique that do not apply to other mallet instruments. So I wanted to write a piece that would be almost like a profoundly detailed look at the vibraphone as an instrument that no other instrument could come close to reproducing. Right? So it absolutely would not be possible on piano or on marimba or on xylophone or glockenspiel. It would have to be a vibraphone piece for it to work. So I looked at all the repertoire and I was shocked by how few pieces there were that actually took the nature of the instrument into consideration in a really serious way. The number of pieces that treat the vibraphone as though it were a really serious instrument on the same level as a violin, there's almost nothing. There's a lot of novelty pieces. There are short little superficial pieces that don't really do very much. Lots of pieces that are arrangements or that could just as easily be piano pieces or whatever. Very, very few pieces that really go far in terms of the instrument's technique. And the way I ultimately resolved it was by looking at jazz, as I say, and particularly Gary Burton, who is a legendary vibraphone player who completely revolutionized the technique of the instrument. He was the first person to start playing the vibraphone with 4 mallets. Up to that point, it had been strictly a 2-mallet technique. So the technique of selective dampening of notes with the pedal remaining down was something that was really crucial in that piece. And I got that from Gary Burton. So, and then the piece has all these different sections in it that are demarcated by different textures. So I tried to find a way to differentiate the instrument's technical possibilities as much as possible so that the different sections would be really contrasting with each other. So anyway, if that was at all successful, then I'm really pleased because I put a lot of work into understanding the instrument and trying to write something that would be engaging to listen to.
Yeah, I mean, also, I mean, talking about stopping, the moment where they play what is it, the triangle, the
Yeah, there's a triangle, and it happens twice. There's a triangle, glockenspiel, and shoot, what do you call that? The I always forget the name of those mounted symbols.
Okay, no, but
anyway.
but I mean, I can't help but think of a
Protals. That's it.
But I mean, in those moments, I can't help to think of how do you say un réveil. You know, when you wake up in the morning, a clock.
Oh yes, yeah.
And I mean, especially because before that you have this sonority of the two vibraphones, which is kind of dreamlike, and then there's this abrupt sonority that reminds me of a I don't know the word, but Wecker in German. Do you know Réveil?
Yeah. Alarm clock.
Alarm clock.
Yeah.
And
well, look, the function of those things in the piece is really pretty straightforward. It seems to me as a composer that it's important, in order for the listener to grasp the particularity of a given material, you have to also show them something that is the opposite of that material. Because then you can see it with blinding clarity, what it actually is that you're hearing. So those interjections are just, they're a way of interrupting what you've been hearing so far and framing it differently, so that you hear it, so that you realize that there is a frame around it, and then outside of that frame you have this other completely different thing. And then when you go back to hearing it again, it doesn't sound the same anymore, because suddenly you're a bit uncomfortable, because you realize that there's this other world that is just outside of the frame of the piece. So that, I hope that doesn't sound overly abstract, but that's how I thought about it. I can't think of a clearer way to explain it than that. But very often in my piece, you'll have a thing that establishes itself, and then there's something else that interrupts it, or that represents a kind of opposite. And the point of it is it's not to blow the piece apart or to destroy the continuity. It's actually to make it so that the piece holds together more. It's to create a kind of cohesion, because you have a more precise understanding of what the material is. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's a hard thing for me to try to put into words.
And I was also wondering if, when you write a new piece, do you actively try to not only write something new for yourself, but for the music world, so to say? Do you actively try to write something that nobody has done before, or yeah?
I don't try to write something nobody's heard before, because I don't not try to do it, but that's not something I consciously try to do. I think that if you want to make something that sounds new, it has to first of all be new for you, for the composer. You have to, I think the composer has to surprise themselves. So that's step number one. And second, and number two, I think it has to be grounded in something real and authentic in order to have a chance of that happening. So obviously, I have my individuality and my own background that is unique, and the things that I'm interested in, and so on. And I think that if those things are properly integrated into my work, then the result, as long as there's not some kind of schism there where I'm rejecting certain things arbitrarily, and through some kind of ideological process, focusing on the things that I think the piece should do, as opposed to maybe what it wants to do, then I think you can't help but have a certain newness about the piece.
Yes.
And especially if you're not simply trying to copy what everybody else is doing. I mean, one of the paradoxical things about the new music world is that you have thousands of composers subscribing to the idea that a piece should be new, and writing music that sounds almost identical to what everybody else is doing, because they're all trying to seek a quality of newness in the exact same way.
Yeah.
So I don't think that gets you very far. I think that you can locate the new and the authentic and the generative and the productive by locating yourself in the music of the past and seeking those particular things that resonate with you and seeing how you can extend them or transform them. If your time window is limited to between 20 years ago and the present, and that's what you're focused on exclusively, then I think it's very difficult to do anything that's actually new. What you'll end up doing probably is something that's highly derivative of what thousands of people are already doing.
And so what are you currently working on? What are your projects for this year?
Currently, I'm writing a piece for the Nouvel Ensemble Moderne in Montreal, and that's going to be a piece for 16 instruments. I've got a bit of time on that one, but I want to start it early. I'm working on a large discographic project also. We're going to do a double CD early next year that will include all of my orchestral pieces and also my pieces for ensemble that haven't been recorded yet. So that's quite a big project. And that actually involved completely rewriting the violin concerto and also completely rewriting another orchestral piece called The Flash of the Instant. So both of those revisions took about 6 to 8 months to finish. And anyway, so I'm very excited about that. And then I'm also writing a piece for, you won't believe this, you'll probably make fun of me, but I'm writing a piece for solo sopranino saxophone.
Wow.
So that's another gigantic challenge because I don't like saxophones. The only saxophones that I like are the extreme ones, the really low ones and the really high ones. The alto saxophone I can't stand. I don't like the sound of that instrument at all. And that's the one that you most often encounter. The sopranino is interesting though. And what I'm going to try to do with this piece is to relate the instrument more closely to its origins. So we know that when the saxophone was invented in around 1846 by Adolphe Sax, it was intended as an outdoor military instrument, something that would have a certain power and a sufficient thickness to the sound that it could carry in an outdoor environment. And of course, he was also trying to make a hybrid between brass instruments and woodwind instruments. That venture, that aspect of the saxophone failed. It didn't become a successful military instrument, really. It only caught on in the early decades of the 20th century in a way that Sax could never possibly have imagined. And then it became sort of hijacked as a, well, not hijacked, but let's say repurposed as a jazz instrument. And after that, it became taken up by the professors at the Conservatoire in Paris as a classical instrument that could play, you know, morceaux de concours and morceaux de salon and all of these, you know, very virtuosic, highly technical things that are, you know, not very interesting. And those are the things that every classical saxophonist plays now. And I'm not interested in that repertoire at all. And I'm also not particularly interested in jazz. But I thought, well, what if you could relate it back to what it was actually invented to do, which is this kind of raucous outdoor instrument playing marching music, and take that and kind of turn it on its head. So and you can do that with the sopranino because it was part of the original saxophone family, but it's like a shadow member of the saxophones. It never really caught on. So it kind of exists, but it doesn't really have an identity. There's only a few pieces written for it. So I love the idea of taking these instruments that didn't quite catch on and then trying to create a character for them.
Okay, I'm really looking forward to it. and to all the other pieces. Thank you very much, Samuel, for talking with me and taking the time. It was a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.